Marcus Hayes stood in front of the full-length mirror in his penthouse, adjusting the modest, plain clothes he'd chosen for today's visit. The decision to dress down was deliberate. He wanted to see the world from a different perspective, to feel, if only briefly, what it was like to be invisible again. The last time he had felt this way was decades ago, when the only suit he owned was one he had borrowed for a job interview. That day, his resume was strong enough to overshadow his attire, but he never forgot the sideways glances and skeptical looks from the interview panel. Now, as a self-made billionaire, those days seemed far behind, yet not entirely out of reach. The plan was simple. Enter the luxury boutique without the trappings of wealth and observe how he would be treated. He wanted to expose, once and for all, the ugly truth he suspected lingered beneath the polished veneer of high society. Naomi, his assistant, had warned him it might be a futile exercise, but Marcus was resolute. It wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who weren't afforded the respect they deserved because they didn't fit a certain mold. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" Naomi asked, her voice filled with concern as she watched him from the doorway. She was dressed in her usual sophisticated style, a sharp contrast to Marcus's deliberately unassuming appearance. "I have to know, Naomi. If they treat me like dirt because of how I look today, imagine what they do to people who can't change out of these clothes," Marcus replied, his tone firm yet reflective. Naomi sighed, crossing her arms. "And what will you do if they do exactly that? What's the plan?" Marcus turned to face her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I won't react right away. I'll keep my cool, gather the evidence, and then we'll see who's laughing." The boutique was everything one would expect from a high-end store catering to the elite. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and sleek, minimalistic displays showcasing the latest designer collections. The sales staff, clad in all black, moved gracefully around the space, attending to the well-heeled clientele with practiced smiles and perfect posture. Marcus entered, his head held high, but the weight of his clothes, a simple, worn jacket over a faded shirt, seemed to pull him down in the eyes of those who noticed him. For a moment, he was back in that interview room, feeling the same judgmental eyes assessing him, measuring his worth by the fabric on his back. "May I help you?" A voice, dripping with condescension, broke through his thoughts. He turned to see a man, presumably the store manager, eyeing him with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Richard Thompson, as his name tag indicated, was everything Marcus expected. Impeccably dressed, graying at the temples, and exuding an air of superiority. "Yes, I'm looking for a gift," Marcus replied evenly, refusing to let the man's attitude rattle him. "For whom?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow as if the question was more about whether Marcus could afford anything in the store. "Myself," Marcus said, the hint of a challenge in his voice. Richard's gaze swept over him again, this time more lingering, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank. "We have a very exclusive selection, sir. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable browsing in one of our other locations?" His tone suggested that Marcus would be better suited for a thrift store than this temple of luxury. Marcus felt a flicker of anger, but tamped it down. "I'm quite comfortable here. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to see what you have." Richard hesitated, his professional smile slipping for just a moment. It was clear he didn't want to waste time on someone who, in his eyes, wasn't worth it. But the rules of customer service dictated otherwise. "Very well," he said, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. They walked past displays of fine leather goods and custom-tailored suits, each item more expensive than the last. Richard kept a step ahead, ensuring that Marcus couldn't touch anything unless invited. It was as if Marcus's very presence might taint the merchandise. When they reached a particularly opulent section of the store, Richard finally stopped. "This collection is our latest. Italian silk, hand-stitched. Only a handful of these have been made worldwide." Marcus reached out to feel the fabric, but Richard quickly intercepted. "Perhaps it would be better to admire from a distance," he suggested with a tight smile. "This piece is valued at over $25,000. "I see," Marcus replied, withdrawing his hand. The anger was simmering just beneath the surface now, but he kept his voice calm. "And what would you recommend for someone like me?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps something more practical. We have a fine selection of ties over there. He pointed towards a small, less prominent section of the store. The implication was clear. Marcus didn't belong in this section. The insult was almost laughable, but Marcus felt a deep pang of sadness rather than amusement. This was the reality for so many people, judged and dismissed based on appearances alone. He nodded politely, pretending to consider the ties, but his mind was racing. After a few more minutes of pointless browsing, during which Richard hovered at a distance, clearly eager for Marcus to leave, Marcus finally decided he had seen enough. "Thank you for your time," Marcus said, turning to Richard with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Richard gave a curt nod, relief evident in his expression. "Of course, sir. If you ever need assistance with something more suitable, we'll be here." Marcus walked out of the store, the anger now fully burning in his chest. It wasn't just about the slight against him. It was the system that allowed, even encouraged, this kind of treatment. He knew what he had to do. Back in his penthouse, Marcus was quiet as he shed his disguise. Naomi watched him carefully, sensing the storm brewing just beneath his calm exterior. "So," she prompted, when the silence became too heavy. Marcus looked at her, his eyes dark with resolve. "We're going back tomorrow, but this time, they'll see me as I am, and they'll regret every second of today." Naomi nodded, her own anger bubbling up in response to his. "I'll make the arrangements." "Media?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "And legal. We're going to make a spectacle of this." As she began to make the necessary calls, Marcus stood by the window, looking out over the city that had once chewed him up and spat him out, only for him to rise stronger and more determined than ever. Tomorrow would be a day to remember, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. The next morning, Marcus's return to the store was nothing short of a spectacle. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb, attracting the attention of passers-by and paparazzi alike. Marcus stepped out, now dressed in an impeccable suit that fit him like a second skin. His presence was magnetic, drawing eyes from all directions. Naomi followed closely behind, her expression fierce as she surveyed the crowd gathering outside the boutique. The media had shown up in full force, just as planned, their cameras flashing as Marcus approached the entrance. Inside, Richard Thompson was blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit. He was attending to another client, his usual air of superiority in full display, when the doors swung open and Marcus entered. The change in Richard's demeanor was instantaneous. His eyes widened in recognition, then quickly darted to the cameras following Marcus's every move. He stumbled over his words as he tried to excuse himself from the client he was attending, panic creeping into his voice. "Mr. Hayes," Richard stammered, rushing over. I didn't expect." Marcus silenced him with a look, then turned to the cameras. "This is the man who judged me yesterday, not by my character or my history, but by my clothes and my skin. I wonder how many others have suffered the same treatment in silence." Richard's face turned ashen as Marcus continued, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had no idea that the man he had dismissed so casually was the owner of one of the most successful companies in the country. The media captured every moment, the flash of cameras and the murmur of the crowd creating a tense atmosphere. Marcus's voice was steady, controlled, but there was no mistaking the underlying fury. "This store will no longer be a sanctuary for the privileged few," Marcus declared. "From today forward, it will stand as a symbol of equality and respect. And as for you, Mr. Thompson," he turned to the trembling manager, "you have two choices. Walk away in disgrace or stay and learn what it means to truly serve the community." The crowd erupted in applause, some shouting their support, while Richard simply stood there, frozen in place. The reality of his situation was sinking in fast. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Marcus nodded to Naomi, who stepped forward with a prepared statement. "We will be issuing a formal press release later today," she announced to the reporters. "But for now, know that Mr. Hayes is committed to transforming this store into a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." As they left the store, Marcus could feel the shift in the air. This was just the beginning, but it was enough to set the wheels of change in motion. The look on Richard's face had been priceless, but it was the impact this would have on the community that truly mattered to him. Back in the SUV, Naomi turned to Marcus, a satisfied smile on her face. "That was perfect," she said. "It's not over yet," Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on the store as they drove away. "We have a lot of work to do." But for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the right path. The battle was far from won, but today they had made a statement, one that would echo far beyond the walls of that boutique. Marcus sat in his penthouse, staring at the skyline as dawn began to break over the city. The events of the previous day played over and over in his mind. The sneers, the dismissive tones, the way Richard Thompson had looked at him like he was nothing. Despite the billions in his bank account, Marcus had never felt so small. Naomi entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Marcus and sat down beside him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Have you slept at all?" she asked, knowing the answer before he spoke. Marcus shook his head. "I couldn't. I keep thinking about it, Naomi. All those years I've spent climbing to the top, proving myself, and in a single moment, none of it mattered. It was just like I was that kid again, back in the projects, being told I'd never amount to anything." Naomi placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You're not that kid anymore, Marcus. You've come so far. What happened yesterday was wrong. There's no denying that. But you have the power to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "I know. That's why I can't let it go. I'm going to make sure Richard and people like him understand that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not anymore." Naomi smiled slightly, her eyes glinting with approval. "That's the Marcus Hayes I know. So, what's the plan?" Marcus turned to face her fully, his eyes sharp and focused now. "We're going to hit them where it hurts, publicly. I want the world to see what happens when you judge someone by their appearance. We'll make this a story they can't ignore." Naomi leaned back, considering the logistics. "We'll need to get the media involved, and not just any media, journalists who care about social justice, people who can tell the story the way it needs to be told." "Clara Mendez," Marcus said without hesitation. "She's been covering issues like this for years. She won't sugarcoat it, and she won't let anyone twist the narrative." Naomi nodded. "I'll reach out to her." "And what about legal? We need to make sure everything's airtight." "Already ahead of you," Marcus replied, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "I've got my legal team on standby. They'll be ready to handle any fallout. Lawsuits, media inquiries, whatever comes our way." Naomi set down her coffee, already switching into full-on work mode. "I'll start making the calls. We need to move quickly. If we time this right, we can have everything in place by this afternoon." Marcus stood up, the tension in his body gradually giving way to resolve. "Let's do it. By the end of today, they're going to wish they'd never underestimated me." Clara Mendez paced the small conference room of her office, phone pressed to her ear as she listened to Naomi outline the plan. Her heart raced with excitement and a sense of justice. This was the kind of story she lived for. "Are you sure Marcus wants to go public with this?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with both awe and caution. "I mean, this could get messy." Naomi's voice was firm on the other end. "He's sure. This isn't just about him, Clara. It's about exposing a system that's been rigged against people like him for too long. Marcus wants to make an example of this, and we need someone who understands what's at stake." Clara stopped pacing, her mind already racing with ideas. "All right, I'm in. I'll need full access to him and his team. No filters, no PR spin." "You'll have it," Naomi assured her. "We trust you to tell the story right." Clara smiled, a fierce determination settling over her. "You won't regret this, Naomi. We'll make sure the world knows exactly what happened and why it matters." By noon, Marcus's penthouse was a hive of activity. Journalists, camera crews, and legal advisors filled the space, creating a controlled chaos that only heightened the tension. Marcus, now dressed in his usual sharp, tailored suit, moved through the crowd with a quiet intensity, occasionally stopping to give directions or answer questions. Clara arrived with her camera crew in tow, her eyes immediately locking onto Marcus. She made her way over to him, dodging people as she went. "Marcus," she greeted him, extending her hand. Thanks for letting me cover this. He shook her hand firmly, his gaze steady. Thank you for doing this, Clara. I know this isn't an easy story to tell. Clara nodded. The best ones never are, but they're the most important. Marcus gave her a small, appreciative smile. I agree. Let's make this count. The trip to the boutique was brief, but the atmosphere inside the SUVs was charged with anticipation. Naomi sat beside Marcus, her phone constantly buzzing with updates as she coordinated the arrival of the media at the store. Everything's set, she said, glancing at Marcus. They're ready for you. Marcus stared out the window, the city blurring past. Good. Let's make sure they never forget this day. When they arrived, the scene was exactly as they'd planned. A crowd had already gathered, drawn by the presence of the media and the spectacle of the moment. Marcus stepped out of the SUV, the cameras immediately focusing on him as he walked toward the entrance. Richard Thompson was standing near the entrance, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. He had clearly been warned that something was happening, but the scale of it had caught him off guard. Mr. Hayes, Richard began, his voice wavering slightly. I didn't expect. Marcus cut him off, his voice cold and measured. You didn't expect to see me again, did you? Not like this. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the cameras. I didn't realize who you were yesterday. If I had known. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I was nobody. That's how you treat people who don't fit your idea of worth, isn't it? The crowd, sensing the tension, grew quieter, the cameras capturing every word, every expression. Richard's face paled, his carefully composed facade beginning to crack under the pressure. I didn't mean, Richard stammered, but Marcus was relentless. You didn't mean to what? To show your true colors? To reveal the kind of person you are when you think no one important is watching. Marcus's voice was sharp, cutting through Richard's attempts to backpedal. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail him. He looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was none. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was watching, and Marcus was in control. This isn't just about me, Marcus continued, addressing the cameras now. This is about every person who's ever been judged, dismissed, or mistreated because they didn't look the part. This is about the systemic discrimination that people like Richard perpetuate every day. The crowd began to murmur, some nodding in agreement, others whispering amongst themselves. Marcus could see the impact his words were having, and he pressed on. From this day forward, this store will no longer be a place where people are judged by their appearance. It will be a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. He turned to Richard, his expression unyielding. You have two choices, leave or stay and learn what it means to truly serve the community. Richard looked like he might faint, his face ashen. He glanced around, seeing no sympathy, no support from anyone present. With a shaky nod, he managed to whisper, I'll stay. Marcus nodded curtly, signaling Naomi to take over. She stepped forward, her tone professional but firm. Mr. Thompson, you will undergo a rigorous training program on diversity and inclusion. Your progress will be monitored closely, and only if you demonstrate significant improvement will you be allowed to continue in a position here. Richard nodded again, his body trembling slightly as the weight of the situation settled on him. Naomi turned back to the cameras. We'll be issuing a formal press release later today, detailing the changes that will be implemented at this store and across the company. We want to assure everyone that we are committed to creating an inclusive and respectful environment for all. As Naomi continued to speak, Marcus stepped back, letting the reality of the moment wash over him. He had done it. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the excitement and tension giving way to a sense of resolution. Marcus watched as the media packed up their equipment, the journalists still buzzing with the energy of the story they had just witnessed. Clara approached Marcus, her expression thoughtful. That was intense. You really made your point. Marcus nodded, a hint of weariness in his eyes. I had to. This isn't just about one store or one man. It's about changing the way people think. Clara smiled, a mix of admiration and respect in her gaze. And you've started something today. This is going to resonate far beyond this place. Marcus looked around, taking in the scene one last time. I hope so, Clara. I really hope so. Back at the penthouse, the mood was one of quiet triumph. Marcus sat with Naomi, both of them decompressing after the whirlwind of the day. You did it, Naomi said softly, a proud smile on her face. Marcus exhaled, the tension finally releasing from his body. We did it. But this is just the beginning. There's so much more work to be done. Naomi nodded in agreement. And we'll do it. One step at a time. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Thank you, Naomi. For everything. Naomi reached over, squeezing his hand gently. Always, Marcus. We're in this together. As the city lights twinkled outside, Marcus felt a deep sense of resolve. The battle wasn't over, but today, they had won a significant victory. And with Naomi by his side, he knew they could take on whatever came next. The following morning, Marcus Hayes woke up with a sense of purpose that was sharper than ever. The confrontation at the boutique had been just the beginning, but now came the real challenge, transforming the space and sending a powerful message to the world. He knew that the actions he took today would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been marginalized or underestimated. As he prepared for the day, Marcus thought back to the look on Richard Thompson's face, pale, trembling, filled with fear. It had been satisfying to see, but Marcus was not one to take joy in another person's suffering. His goal was never simply to humiliate. It was to educate and to bring about change. Still, he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Richard brought down a peg, knowing that for once, justice had been served, even if just a little. Naomi met him in the living room, her face bright with determination. The team is already at the store, and we have a few more media outlets wanting in on the story, she said as she handed him a tablet with the day's schedule. Marcus scanned the list. I want everything to run smoothly. We can't afford any slip-ups today. Every detail matters. Naomi nodded. Don't worry, Marcus. We've got this. And Richard, well, he's agreed to the training program. He didn't have much of a choice. Marcus raised an eyebrow. I wasn't sure if he'd go through with it. Naomi shrugged. Fear is a powerful motivator. But whether he'll actually change, that's another story. Marcus's expression grew more serious. We're giving him a chance, Naomi. That's all we can do. What he does with it is up to him. Arriving at the store, Marcus was greeted by a flurry of activity. Construction crews were already at work, preparing to overhaul the space. The air was filled with the sounds of drills, hammers, and the buzz of conversation as designers and architects discussed plans for the new layout. Marcus walked through the store, taking in the changes. The luxury items were being packed away, replaced with displays that would celebrate diversity and inclusivity. The cold, sterile atmosphere was being transformed into something warm and inviting, a place where everyone would feel welcome. As he moved through the space, he noticed Richard standing awkwardly to the side, watching the chaos unfold. Gone was the arrogance that had once defined him. In its place was a man who seemed lost, unsure of where he fit into this new world that was being built around him. Richard saw Marcus approaching and straightened, his eyes darting nervously as he prepared to speak. Mr. Hayes, he began, his voice unsteady, I just wanted to say thank you for giving me this chance. Marcus regarded him for a moment, measuring his sincerity. I'm not doing this for you, Richard. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Whether you take this opportunity seriously is up to you. Richard swallowed, nodding slowly. I understand. I'll do my best. Marcus gave a curt nod. See that you do. You'll be closely monitored, and I won't hesitate to take action if you slip back into old habits. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he nodded again. I won't disappoint you, sir. As Richard walked away, Marcus turned to Naomi, who had been observing the exchange. What do you think? He asked her quietly. Naomi hesitated, then sighed. I think he's scared. Whether that fear will lead to real change, I don't know. But you're right to give him this chance. It's more than most people would do. Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. We'll see, Naomi. We'll see. Later that afternoon, the store was a hive of activity as journalists and influencers arrived to cover the transformation. Clara Mendez was among them, her eyes sharp as she observed the scene. She had seen many stories of change, but something about this one felt different. There was a sense of momentum, of something big happening that went beyond just a single store. She found Marcus near the entrance, talking with a group of designers. Waiting until he finished, she approached him with a smile. "You've got quite the operation going here," she said. Marcus returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're trying to make a statement, Clara. This isn't just about changing the decor, it's about changing the way people think." Clara nodded, her gaze intense. "And do you think you can do that? One store, one city? Is it enough?" Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "It's a start. I know we can't change the world overnight, but if we can make even a small difference here, it might inspire others to do the same." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. Every change starts somewhere. And if anyone can make it happen, it's you." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but there was a weight in his chest that he couldn't shake. He knew that the changes he was implementing were just the beginning, that there was a long road ahead filled with challenges and resistance. But he also knew that if he didn't try, if he didn't push for something better, then nothing would ever change. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself alone in the back office, reviewing the plans for the store's relaunch. Naomi had stepped out to coordinate with the legal team, leaving Marcus with a rare moment of solitude. He looked around the room, at the blueprints and sketches that covered the desk, and felt a pang of doubt. Was he really making a difference? Or was this all just a show, a way to soothe his own conscience? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Looking up, he saw Richard standing there, looking more uncomfortable than ever. "Come in, Richard," Marcus said, gesturing for him to enter. Richard stepped inside, hesitating before speaking. I wanted to ask you something, if that's all right." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. "Go ahead." Richard shifted nervously. "Do you really think I can change? I mean, I want to, but I don't know if I'm capable of being the kind of person you want me to be." Marcus was silent for a moment, considering his response. "Change isn't easy, Richard. It takes time, and it takes effort. But the fact that you're asking this question means you're already on the right path." Richard looked down at his hands, his voice low. "I've been this way for so long. I don't know how to be any different." Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "You start by recognizing that the way you were wasn't right. You educate yourself, you listen to others, and you make a conscious effort to be better every day. It won't be easy, and you'll make mistakes, but you have to keep trying." Richard looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. "And if I fail?" Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Then you get up and try again. Change isn't about being perfect, it's about making progress." Richard nodded slowly, the weight of his own words settling on him. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I'll do my best." As Richard left the office, Marcus watched him go, a mixture of hope and skepticism in his heart. He wanted to believe that people could change, that Richard could change, but he knew that it wasn't something that happened overnight. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The store's grand reopening was set for the following week, and as the day approached, the anticipation grew. Marcus's team worked tirelessly to ensure that everything was perfect: the new layout, the new merchandise, the messaging that would be front and center for all who entered. On the morning of the reopening, Marcus stood outside the store, watching as the final preparations were made. Naomi joined him, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "It's really happening," she said, almost in disbelief. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It is, and it's just the beginning." The doors opened to a wave of people, some curious, some skeptical, others excited to see what the new store would offer. As they entered, they were greeted by displays that celebrated diversity, with mannequins of all shapes, sizes, and colors, and artwork that reflected a wide range of cultures and experiences. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, exclusive vibe that had once dominated the space. It was clear that this was no longer a store for the elite, but a place where everyone was welcome. Marcus moved through the crowd, observing the reactions of the customers. Some were delighted, others seemed uncertain, but overall, the response was positive. He caught sight of Clara interviewing a few of the customers, capturing their thoughts on the transformation. As he approached her, she turned to him with a grin. "Looks like you've made quite an impression." Marcus chuckled softly. "That's the idea. Now let's see if it lasts." Clara's expression turned serious. "You know there's going to be pushback, right? Not everyone is going to be on board with this." Marcus sighed, nodding. "I know, but I'm ready for it. We have to be." As the day went on, the store buzzed with activity. Richard, still nervous but more composed, was at the entrance, greeting customers and guiding them through the new layout. Naomi watched him closely, ready to step in if needed, but for now, he seemed to be handling it well. By the time evening rolled around, Marcus was exhausted but pleased. The reopening had been a success, and the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. But he knew that this was just the first step in a much larger journey. As he and Naomi prepared to leave, Richard approached them, looking hesitant. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Scott, I just wanted to thank you both for everything. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'm trying." Naomi smiled warmly. "That's all we ask, Richard. Keep trying and keep learning. That's what matters." Marcus nodded in agreement. "You've made it through the first day, Richard. Now comes the hard part, making it last." Richard nodded, his expression serious. "I won't let you down." As they left the store, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a realization that the journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but for now, they had taken a significant step forward. And that, in itself, was worth celebrating. The night air was cool as Marcus and Naomi walked back to the car. The city lights twinkled around them, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had started something that could truly change the world. But deep down, he knew that the hardest battles were yet to come, and he was ready for them. The day after the grand reopening, the store hummed with the energy of its transformation. The initial success had been undeniable. Customers streamed in, media buzzed with stories of the change, and for a brief moment, it felt like Marcus Hayes had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. But Marcus knew better than to rest on his laurels. The real work was just beginning. Marcus stood in his office, the sleek design of the space a sharp contrast to the tension he felt. He was on the phone with Naomi, who had been at the store since early morning. "Any issues so far?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Naomi sighed on the other end. "Nothing major, but there's definitely some resistance. A few of the old regulars aren't too happy with the changes. We had a couple of complaints about the new displays, too political, they said." Marcus rubbed his temples, the stress beginning to weigh on him. "It was expected. We're challenging the status quo. There's bound to be pushback." Naomi's tone softened. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, Marcus, but we're doing the right thing. And the positive response far outweighs the negative." Marcus nodded to himself, trying to hold on to that truth. "You're right. Keep me updated. I'll be there in a few hours." As he hung up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The city was bustling below, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of the store. He couldn't shake the feeling that despite the positive press and the apparent success, something was off. There was an unease in the air, a tension that he couldn't quite put his finger on. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Clara Mendez, the journalist who had been following the story from the start. She entered, her expression curious as she approached Marcus's desk. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Of course, Clara. What's on your mind?" Clara sat down, placing her notepad on the desk. "I've been hearing some whispers, nothing concrete, but enough to raise a few red flags. There's talk among some of the employees, particularly the ones who were here before the transformation. They're uneasy about the changes. Some of them feel like they're being forced to embrace something they don't fully understand or agree with." Marcus frowned, his mind racing. "I expected some resistance, but I didn't think it would be this soon." What are they saying exactly? Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It's mostly grumbling, but there's a sense that they feel alienated. Like this store is no longer a place for them. Like they've been replaced, even if they're still physically here. Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on the big picture, on making a statement, that he hadn't fully considered the human element, the people who had worked at the store long before he ever set foot in it. Maybe I've been too heavy-handed, Marcus admitted, his voice low. I wanted to make a point, but I didn't think about how it would affect the people who weren't ready for this kind of change. Clara leaned forward, her gaze sympathetic. Change is hard, Marcus, especially when it challenges people's deeply held beliefs. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you have to find a way to bring people along with you, rather than leaving them behind. Marcus nodded, appreciating her insight. You're right. I need to address this before it spirals out of control. If we lose the support of the employees, this whole thing could fall apart. Clara smiled gently. You've got the right instincts, Marcus. You just need to make sure the people who are part of this feel valued, not threatened. Marcus stood, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. I'm going to the store now. I need to talk to them directly, see how they're feeling, and figure out a way to make this work for everyone. Clara rose as well, her expression supportive. Good luck. I'll be following the story closely. If you need anything, just let me know. As she left, Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. He had always known that transforming the store would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated just how deeply the resistance would run. Now, he had to find a way to bridge the gap between the old and the new, to create a space where everyone felt like they belonged. When Marcus arrived at the store, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the day before. The energy that had filled the space during the reopening had dimmed, replaced by a subtle tension that hung in the air. Employees moved about their tasks with forced smiles, their unease palpable. Naomi met him at the entrance, her expression concerned. I've been trying to smooth things over, but there's definitely a rift forming. Some of the old staff are talking about quitting. They feel like they're being pushed out. Marcus frowned, his heart sinking. I need to talk to them, directly, get a sense of what's really going on. Naomi nodded. I'll gather them in the break room. They'll listen to you, Marcus. As Naomi went to gather the staff, Marcus took a moment to walk through the store, observing the changes with a critical eye. The new displays were bold, unapologetic in their celebration of diversity. But as much as he loved what they represented, he could see how they might feel jarring to those who weren't prepared for such a drastic shift. In the break room, a group of employees gathered, their expressions a mix of apprehension and frustration. Marcus entered, his demeanor calm but authoritative. He needed them to see that he was here to listen, not to dictate. Thank you all for coming, Marcus began, his voice steady. I wanted to have this conversation because I've been hearing some concerns about the changes we've made to the store. I want to understand how you're feeling, what's working, and what's not. There was a moment of silence before one of the older employees, a woman named Karen who had been with the store for over 20 years, spoke up. Mr. Hayes, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but it feels like everything we've known, everything we've built here, is being thrown out. This store was like a second home to us, and now it feels like we don't belong. Marcus listened intently, nodding as she spoke. I hear you, Karen, and I'm sorry if it feels like we've disregarded your history here. That was never my intention. But I also believe that this store has the potential to be something greater, to be a place that represents everyone, not just a select few. Another employee, a younger man named Eric, chimed in. It's not that we don't support the changes. It's all happening so fast. We didn't have time to process it, to understand what it means for us. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing something familiar, something that had been a constant in their lives. He understood that fear, even if his own experience of it was different. I know this has been a lot to take in, Marcus said gently, and I should have done a better job of preparing you for it. This transformation isn't just about changing the physical space. It's about changing the way we think, the way we treat each other. But that doesn't mean we're erasing the past. I want to build on it, to create something that honors our history while embracing a more inclusive future. Karen looked at him, her expression softening slightly. We just want to feel like we're still part of this, Mr. Hayes. Like we still matter. Marcus met her gaze, his voice sincere. You do matter. Every one of you is an important part of this store's legacy, and I want you to be part of its future as well. If there are things we need to adjust, I'm open to that. But I need your help to make this work. The room was quiet as the employees absorbed his words. Marcus could see the wheels turning in their minds, the tension beginning to ease as they realized he was truly listening to them. Finally, Karen nodded, her voice steadier. All right, Mr. Hayes. We'll give it a shot. But we need more communication, more involvement in the decisions that are being made. Marcus smiled, relief flooding through him. You'll have it, Karen. I promise. As the meeting ended and the employees returned to their work, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the first real challenge of his plan head-on, and while there was still much to be done, he knew that he had taken an important step toward bridging the gap between the old and the new. Later that evening, as the store closed for the day, Marcus sat in his office with Naomi, reflecting on the events of the day. You handled that well, Naomi said, her tone admiring. They needed to hear from you, to know that you were still on their side. Marcus nodded, though he still felt the weight of the day's events. I didn't realize how much resistance there would be. I thought I could just make these changes and everyone would see the value in them. But I underestimated how deeply people are attached to what they know. Naomi smiled softly. Change is hard, Marcus, even when it's for the better. But you're doing the right thing. You're listening, you're adapting, and that's what will make this work in the long run. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling in. I hope you're right, Naomi. We've got a long road ahead, and I'm not sure what other obstacles we're going to face. Naomi reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. You've got a strong team behind you, and we're all committed to making this a success. Marcus looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. Thank you, Naomi. I couldn't do this without you. Naomi smiled, her eyes warm. We're in this together, Marcus. All the way. As they prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look around the office, thinking about all that had been accomplished and all that was still to come. The road ahead would be challenging, but he knew that with the right approach, they could overcome any obstacle. And as he walked out into the cool night air, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The transformation of the store was just the beginning. The real work lay in changing hearts and minds, in creating a space where everyone felt valued and respected. And that was a mission worth fighting for. The months that followed the store's transformation were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus Hayes had known that changing the store's image and values would be challenging, but he hadn't anticipated the ripple effects that would spread far beyond its walls. The store had become a symbol of something larger, a movement toward inclusivity and equality in places that had long been bastions of exclusivity. Marcus sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, reflecting on how much had changed since that first fateful visit to the boutique. The world was watching, and every decision he made felt like it carried the weight of more than just his own legacy. Naomi entered the room, breaking his reverie. She was carrying a stack of reports, but her expression was softer than usual, as if she could sense the gravity of his thoughts. Marcus, we just got the latest feedback reports, she said, setting the papers on his desk. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Customer satisfaction is at an all-time high, and the media continues to praise the changes we've implemented. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That's good to hear, Naomi. But I can't help but wonder, is it enough? Are we really making the impact we set out to make? Naomi looked at him thoughtfully before speaking. Change takes time, Marcus. We've already accomplished so much. The store is just the beginning. What you've started here has the potential to inspire other businesses, other leaders, to follow suit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, contemplating her words. You're right, but I can't shake the feeling that we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more that needs to be done. Naomi smiled gently. And we'll get there, one step at a time. But for now, you should be proud of what we've achieved. You've taken a stand, and people are taking notice. Later that day, Marcus had a meeting scheduled with Richard Thompson. It had been months since their last direct conversation, and Richard had been quietly undergoing the diversity training program that Marcus had insisted on, The program was rigorous, designed not just to educate but to challenge deeply ingrained biases and encourage personal reflection. When Richard entered the room, he was a different man from the one who had sneered at Marcus on that first day. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. "Mr. Hayes," Richard began, his voice measured but sincere, "I wanted to thank you for giving me this chance and for not giving up on me." Marcus studied him, noting the changes in his demeanor. "Richard, I didn't do this for you personally. I did it because I believe people can change if they're given the right tools and the motivation to do so. But the real question is, what have you learned?" Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've learned that I was wrong about so many things. I used to think that power and privilege were my birthright, that people who didn't have them just didn't deserve them. But I was blind. I didn't see how much my own biases were hurting others and myself." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "And what will you do with that knowledge now? Understanding is one thing, but action is another." Richard took a deep breath. "I want to make amends, Mr. Hayes. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to doing better." Marcus considered his words carefully. "You've come a long way, Richard, but this isn't just about redemption. It's about making a real difference. If you truly want to be part of this, you'll need to continue working on yourself, and you'll need to be willing to speak out when it matters." Richard nodded, his resolve clear. "I will, whatever it takes." Marcus offered him a small, approving smile. "Then let's move forward. There's still a lot of work to be done." As the weeks passed, Marcus threw himself into his philanthropic work with renewed vigor. He expanded his efforts to promote diversity and inclusion beyond the store, working with other businesses, community leaders, and educational institutions to create lasting change. One afternoon, Marcus found himself at a panel discussion on corporate responsibility, seated next to Claire Mendez, who had become a close ally throughout the process. The room was packed with influential figures from the business world, all eager to hear what Marcus had to say. The moderator began with a question directed at Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, your transformation of the boutique has become a case study in how to effectively implement diversity and inclusion in a corporate setting. What advice would you give to other leaders looking to make similar changes?" Marcus took a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance. My advice to other leaders is to listen, really listen, to the people who are most affected by your decisions. Don't just make changes from the top down. Involve everyone in the process. Make it clear that this isn't just a PR move, but a genuine commitment to doing better." Clara nodded in agreement, adding her own thoughts. "And don't be afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. The key is to acknowledge them, learn from them, and take actionable steps to move forward." The discussion continued, with Marcus and Clara fielding questions and sharing their experiences. By the end of the session, the energy in the room was palpable. People were inspired, ready to take what they had learned and apply it in their own lives and businesses. That evening, Marcus returned to his penthouse, exhausted but content. He stood by the window, looking out at the city that had been the backdrop to so much of his life's journey. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Naomi joined him, handing him a glass of wine. "You did good today, Marcus. People are listening." Marcus took the glass, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I just hope they take what they've heard and do something with it. Words are powerful, but actions are what really matter." Naomi smiled, clinking her glass against his. "And you've shown them that. You've shown them that real change is possible." Marcus nodded, taking a sip of his wine. "It's a start, but there's still so much more to do." Naomi chuckled softly. "You're never satisfied, are you?" Marcus smiled, a touch of humor in his eyes. "Not when it comes to this. There's always more that can be done, more people who need to be reached." Naomi looked at him with a mix of admiration and affection. "That's why you're the one leading this charge, Marcus. You have the vision, and you have the drive. And the rest of us are here to help you make it happen." Marcus set down his glass, his expression serious once more. "I couldn't do this without you, Naomi. You've been my rock through all of this." Naomi reached out, squeezing his hand gently. "We're a team, Marcus, and we're just getting started." Months later, the store that had once been a symbol of elitism and exclusion was now thriving as a model of inclusivity and diversity. The new management team, led by Naomi, had fully embraced the values that Marcus had instilled, and the results were clear. Sales were up, customer loyalty was stronger than ever, and the store had become a beloved part of the community. Richard Thompson had taken on a new role within the company, working on outreach and education initiatives to promote diversity in the workplace. It wasn't an easy job, but he approached it with a level of dedication and humility that surprised even Marcus. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through the store, he saw Richard giving a presentation to a group of new employees, sharing his own experiences and the lessons he had learned. Marcus watched from a distance, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. Richard had come a long way, and while there was still work to be done, it was clear that he was committed to the journey. As Marcus continued through the store, he was greeted by smiles and nods from the staff, people who had once been skeptical but who had come to embrace the new direction. The transformation was complete, but the work was far from over. In the months that followed, Marcus's efforts to promote diversity and inclusion continued to expand. He launched new initiatives through his foundation, partnered with other businesses to share best practices, and even worked with policymakers to advocate for broader societal change. But despite all the progress, Marcus knew that the fight against discrimination and prejudice was ongoing. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, and he was ready for them. As he sat in his office one evening, reviewing the latest reports, Naomi entered with a stack of mail. "You've got a lot of fan mail, Marcus. People are really inspired by what you're doing." Marcus smiled, flipping through the letters. "It's not about me, Naomi. It's about what we're trying to achieve." Naomi leaned against the desk, her expression thoughtful. "But you're the one who's made it possible. You've taken a stand when others wouldn't, and you've shown people that real change is possible." Marcus set the letters aside, his gaze distant. "Maybe, but it's not enough to just inspire people. We have to make sure that the changes we've made are lasting, that they don't fade away once the spotlight is off." Naomi nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "And that's why we keep pushing, keep fighting for what's right." Marcus looked at her, a sense of resolve settling over him. "Exactly. We're in this for the long haul, Naomi. And as long as there's work to be done, we won't stop." Naomi smiled, her confidence in him unwavering. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the night stretched on, Marcus and Naomi continued to work, side by side, fueled by the knowledge that their efforts were making a difference. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but together, they were ready to face whatever came next. And as Marcus looked out at the city once more, he knew that while the battle was far from over, they had already won something invaluable: the belief that change was possible and that justice, no matter how delayed, could prevail.